Senator Case,
Present.
Senator French.
Here.
Senator Ide,
Here.
Senator Pappas.
Here.
Chairman McEwen.
Here.
All present, Mr. Chairman.
Sounds good. We got quite a bit to get done today, so we're gonna go through things a little quickly. We'll start out with Senate File 151. Senator Jones.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and fellow senators. This is a quick little bill that I brought on behalf of some of our county treasurers. Currently, right now, the monthly mineral estimated payments are made and distributed using the previous year's mill. The actual mill that some entities should receive isn't applied until the true up in September. If an entity lowers its mill or has satisfied a bond and doesn't need the mill, they continue receiving the previous year's mill until the true up. So the problem with that is they are receiving funds not due to them, and then they're required to not spend the money and return that to the county. To alleviate this issue and these back and forth payments, the county treasurers, this bill would allow the county treasurers to keep those estimated payments in escrow, and then they can refund them to the producer once that true up has occurred. So basically, they're just gonna hold on to the overages in a trust account, and that way some of our smaller communities and stuff don't have to take the payment and pay it back later on, and alleviates a lot of issues that way. If you have technical questions, I do think maybe a couple treasurers might be on Zoom to answer questions on this.
Questions? We have people on Zoom, Donna?
We have one person who registered to testify on this bill, Mark Cowan. Would you like me to admit him?
Please bring him in.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Revenue.
Thank you very much. Sweetwater County Treasurer Mark Cowan. This bill is one that I've worked with Senator Jones on. She's done a fantastic job of representing what the bill will do. This actually is a specific issue that we will have in Sweetwater County this year. So I appreciate your support of this bill and here to answer any questions if you need.
Questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else that wants to testify on this? Going once, going.
Budget will not punish them at all. It actually, they will get their full amount. It just that they start escrowing at the time that they've already been paid everything. Just, you know, for example, if they have a bond or something to build a school or a senior center or something, the minute that is satisfied, then that's when the treasurer starts holding the funds in escrow. So it won't hurt the entities at all. It actually just saves them some extra steps. They have to make sure they don't spend those funds between the time their bond was satisfied and the time the true up is finished.
So are we collecting revenue after the bond is satisfied?
We're actually, yes, and we are distributing it. So then it does go back to the producer after the bond is satisfied.
Okay, thank you, Senator Jones. Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I assume if it's in, is there interest earned on that in escrow? If there is, does it, who keeps the interest, or does that go back to, when you
I
repay?
I do believe there is interest earned, and it is a good question. Maybe Mr. Cowan knows where that interest goes. Sorry.
No, I should have asked earlier. Apologies.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, just real quick again, Senator. Good chairman here. I'm still a little bit confused on this here. If the localities choose not to levy ad valorem taxes, how does that affect them by not doing that? Senator, thank you.
Senator Jones?
I don't think this would affect them at all. This is only for communities that have a mill levy out there, or a bond. Like a specific example would be, I think a little town in my district is doing a senior center, and I believe their bond will be satisfied sometime mid-January, maybe it was a few days ago. They keep receiving these payments all the way till September, and then they have to hold on to them, make sure they don't spend them, and then they have to return them back. So they've made it through 2025 collecting these payments, but they aren't actually owed all of them.
Thank you.
So that it only affects those people that have this situation.
Senator French. Want to ask him your question?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was, there's probably interest earned on these funds that are being held before they're returned. Who keeps the interest? Is interest returned to the people that overpaid or whatever, or does the county keep the interest? Thank you.
Did you want me to answer that, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Senator French, great question. As it stands right now, the way this occurs, we would pay these distributions out to the entities. They would hold on to the money. And then during the true up, the money would just be reimbursed back to the mineral producer without interest. And so that would be the same in this scenario. The money would go into an escrow account, be held, and then whatever the overpayment was would be returned to the producer without interest.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
So does that mean the county keeps the interest?
That's the way this bill looks, and that's the way we do it currently. Well, we don't do it currently. Who keeps the interest now would be whoever received those payments. So in the example of our special district here that the senator represented, they would keep the interest and hopefully have the money to pay us back when we come calling for it to give back to the producer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you again for coming back.
You bet.
That will close public comment. Let's move to the bill. Anything on the first page?
Mr. Chairman, I would move Senate File 151.
Senator French has moved it. Senator Pappas seconded. First page, anybody? Second page. Donna, you want to call the roll?
This is a roll call vote on Senate File 151. Senator Case?
Aye.
Senator French?
Aye.
Senator Ide?
Aye.
Senator Pappas?
Aye.
Chairman McEwen?
Aye.
We have 5 aye, Mr. Chairman.
Senate File 151 has passed the Revenue Committee.
Thank you.
Next Next bill up for our consideration is Senate File 185, Governmental Taxation, Property Taxation and Sale. Be Senator Case,
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to do it from here or down there?
wherever you're more comfortable.
This is fine if it's easy on everybody else. Mr. Chairman, this is a bill that's relevant now because of the Supreme Court case involving Uena County and the truck stop over there that brought into question what is a governmental purpose. This bill actually came about several years ago when we had just a ton of interim work in this area. And we worked with, the interim committee worked with the Department of Revenue. Ms. Henson and the assessors produced a really detailed PowerPoint presentation, which I believe has been provided to all of you, about the exemptions under the law and the constitutional framework for those exemptions. And I think if you remember, the Constitution has a list and says land owned by the United States government, if used for a governmental purpose. And this bill was in direct response to that, and predated, of course, the lawsuit, but trying to clarify what is a governmental purpose. I'm not going to try to represent to you that we've caught everything exactly, but this is the bill that we had. It was a budget session and it failed introduction. But if you, this bill has the potential to solve a lot of problems that could happen with subsequent litigation and challenges based on the recent Supreme Court ruling involving Uena County. So, Mr. Chairman, the definitions are kind of where a lot of this meat is. And I'm on page 2. Under A, these are as used in this act unless otherwise specifically provided. Romanet 13 or 18 says governmental purpose means that a majority of the property is used for health, safety, and welfare, education, transportation, infrastructure, or administrative purposes of a governmental entity. Governmental purpose shall not include property owned by a governmental entity acting in its proprietary capacity by conducting activities that are frequently carried on through private enterprises, and shall not include any of the following. A, property used for recreation, including cabin rentals, campgrounds, bowling alleys, movie theaters, shooting ranges, and sports complexes. B, property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, including airplane hangars, leased for private use, property leased for commercial operations, housing for employees, regardless of whether a fee is charged, land leased for agriculture or other use, land under privately owned structures, medical clinics operated by a private entity, and school buildings that are no longer used for governmental purposes. C, idle government property includes vacant land and vacant structures unless the entity is required to hold the property by law. D, governmental property that is held for sale or lease, including business parks and other economic development properties. And let me point out, A through B are where we're making findings, the legislature would be making findings that these are not governmental purposes. So they would not qualify for the exemption that has been the point. It's not a perfect list, Mr. Chairman. I would point out on the way into the Senate, we have a state parks, like their recreation. And so it's not the same as like a bowling alley or something like that. So I'm not saying it's a perfect list. Then we're done with what is land that we have findings that aren't governmental purpose. We're back to definitions because all 4 of those subpoints above were just defining what is not a governmental purpose. So now we're to Romanet 19 and defining what is administrative use. And administrative use, which is a governmental purpose, it means property used for the administration of the government, including without limitation, the state capitol, I guess we're not going to tax it, of the courthouses, city hall buildings, and government office buildings. 20 is education, includes property used for public schools, colleges, and universities, including without limitation, school buildings, administrative buildings, bus barns, arts facilities, and libraries. 21 is health, safety, and welfare, includes without limitation, property used for one or more of the following purposes. It's a big list. Health departments, military and military bases, justice facilities, law enforcement, fire protection, hospitals, animal control, sewer, water systems, garbage collection or disposal, community event centers, including civic centers and recreation centers, fair buildings and fairgrounds, correctional facilities, veterans care facilities. Infrastructure under 22 on page 10, or page 5, line 10, includes without limitation, property used for parks, public grounds, alleys, sidewalks, cemeteries, golf courses, auditoriums, and parking lots. Again, these are all governmental purposes. Transportation includes without limitation, roads, streets, highways, interstates, aviation facilities, public buses, rights of way that are dedicated to the public and construction, maintenance operations, and repair facilities. So the only things that are excluded are A through B under that first definition, okay? And then we come into the exemptions, and this kind of rewrites our existing exemption section. The following property is exempt from property taxation, and this is right out of the Constitution. Property owned by the United States, the majority of which is used primarily for a governmental purpose. And we don't need a list there anymore because we moved the list over to the new section. Property of the state of Wyoming owned and used primarily for a governmental purpose. Again, there was a list in the law. We move it over to the new section. Property of a Wyoming school district owned and used primarily for a governmental purpose, excluding teacherages. I'm not sure that that's used anymore. Property of Wyoming cities and towns owned and used primarily for governmental purposes. Then we have section 2. These are repealers. They kind of relate to that language as it's restructured in the front of the bill. Section 3 is meat in the bill. It sometimes gives people heartburn, but it says not later than January 1st, 2027, any public entity that has held property that has not been used for a governmental purpose as defined in WS 3911-101A, Romanet 23, as amended by section 1 of this act, for a period of 10 years or more, shall make the property available for sale or shall make a finding showing good cause for the delay in using the property for a governmental purpose. That's vacant property that hasn't been used. B, this section shall not apply to property that a public entity is authorized or required to hold by law, including state lands, school lands, or other lands managed by the Board of Land Commissioners pursuant to Title 36 of the Wyoming statutes. So, that covers all that. C is used in this article. Public entity means the state of Wyoming and its agents and municipalities, counties, school districts, political subdivisions, and special districts. It's effective on July 1st of next year, not this year, because this is kind of a big lift. But I speak in support of this bill, Mr. Chairman. I know that it's not quite perfect and people will have ins and outs about it. But most of this is language that's already in the law in the exemption section that's recodified. And we clearly say what we think a governmental purpose is or not. It will help us to meet the challenges imposed by the Wyoming Supreme Court in their ruling in the UNA case. And it's a way to do it in a manner that I think is the fairest and really recognizes that there are the kind of the shades of gray and black and white of what is a governmental purpose or not. It's a superior method to do that than just say anything owned by the government is going to be a governmental purpose, because that's not fair to the private world, but it also can be expansive in what those things are. It does talk about agricultural lands, and it talks about land that's required to be held, like trust land required to be held by the state of Wyoming. It doesn't address head-on the issue that I think some of my colleagues hold, or the tenet that some of them hold, is that if a land lease benefits the school trust, should be tax exempt. I don't really go down that road, and we could have more discussion about that issue And there's a lot to learn there. And that would be very specifically grazing. But this talks about the land itself being tax exempt, so I assume the uses of the land would be tax exempt as well under this bill. That's it. Happy to answer any questions. Ms. Henson, oh boy, that takes me back, helped me write this bill years ago. I haven't talked with her lately about it, but we collaborated a lot on this bill, so I think she could help us too.
I do have a question.
Yes, sir.
So if a county or a city owns property
Mm-hmm,
and they're not using it,
mm-hmm.
they will pay taxes on it?
Mr. Chairman, I think it has to do whether it's got a governmental purpose involved in holding the land. But yes, potentially they could pay taxes on it if it doesn't fall under one of these things. And in fact, it goes farther than that, because if it clearly isn't a governmental purpose for 10 years, they actually could move it off of being public property and cause it to be sold.
I was just wondering if they own it for 10 years and it's a vacant lot not being used, are they covered and call that government use?
Mr. Chairman, I think under some cases it could be, if it's like land held to expand a school, to build a new school, or if it has a kind of a purpose. There's a safety clause where that section is and says that they can kind of show a reason why they are holding it. But in general, yeah, it's trying to get land that's not being used off the tax rolls or off the government rolls.
Senator Ide.
Oh, here we go. You got it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case. I'm not sure I understand this entirely. Number one, I think, our third largest industry is agriculture, and we've had a couple of bills, government-owned property. We had one come out of ag, one out of here. It looks like this bill would essentially tell the ag community that we're gonna tax their grazing lease. If I'm not correct, explain that to me. And number two, I don't see if there was something in here on prohibitions of any sales of these lands to the federal government, the non-use lands or lands that are for sale, because that would be one comment to add to this if I do support the bill, because that's something that's in our US Constitution, that they're anything other than military installations, they're supposed to get the consent of the legislature before they buy any more lands in our state. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Chairman, it does definitely say that under lines 19 through 23 on page 2 and continuing on page 3, property that is leased or possessed by a non-governmental entity, including airplane hangars leased for private use, property leased for commercial operations, housing for employee regardless of whether a fee is used, land leased for agriculture or other use. And so, I guess one basic level question is, if a government leases pasture land and a private entity leases pasture land, why does that not bother us? Why is that not government competition with the private industry? That's my way of throwing it out there, but it's certainly, you could exclude that. This is just language we're gonna write, and you could use the trust lands argument for grazing and exclude it in this bill. I might speak against that, but I think I'd lose. And so I would even help you craft that amendment. And it requires the sale of land, but if the government is required to hold the land, you're not required to sell it. So, that's page 7, lines 15 through 19. So this is our trust land, for example. This section shall not apply to property that a public entity is authorized or required to acquire or hold by law, including state lands, school lands or other lands managed by the Board of Land Commissioners. So all that's out of being forced to be sold. You know, so I can conceive of an amendment that says if the lease of lands benefits a governmental purpose, then it's tax exempt. These guys might push back on how confusing that might be, but that is a possibility. I think this is a really good idea, and I'd like to see us do it, but I don't want to see it get thrown out because we don't know how to treat state grazing leases. You know, so I'm willing to cave on that. I push back, but it's not do or die for me.
Go ahead, Senator Pappas.
Yeah, I just have one question for Senator Case. On section 3 where it requires, on page 7, where it requires the 10 years or more shall make property available for sale, or shall make a finding showing good cause for the delay, which I think is good, because
Yeah.
if a district is planning a school and it's got some land and the state never funds the school, I mean, they still want to eventually build a school. So my question is, who would adjudicate the finding?
And Mr. Chairman, that may not be the very best language, because it says, shall make a finding showing good cause for the delay. We might not even use the word delay, good cause for holding the land, you know. But I would assume it would be a taxpayer, I guess, that could come and say, you're not following the law with respect to this piece of land. And I'm not sure who else would force a government entity to sell that land other than the courts.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I could see
Senator
a
Pappas?
complaint coming against this, but
Yeah.
who would make the decision that it's being held for a good cause or not for a good cause?
It's kind of squishy, I agree.
Kind of think that would be the legislature. Please, Ms. Henson.
Okay. Good afternoon, Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue. And as has been stated, there has been a great deal of testimony, a great amount of discussion related to, quite honestly, are we treating properties owned by the government pursuant to the Constitution? We talked a little bit before when, as stated before, we've had Senate File 81 and we've had Senate File 68, I believe it is, both trying to address the Supreme Court decision that came from State of Wyoming versus Uena County. But this bill demonstrates that this is a much broader concept that needs to be discussed. And it arises because when you have governmental entities that are, and I'm going to give you a weird example. Sometimes as these small communities, don't have certain amenities, they go to the government and they say, we'd really like to have a bowling alley, but, private sector isn't going to come here, so maybe the government could put in a bowling alley. So the question about at what point does a governmental purpose cease to exist? And the Constitution specifically says, based on the changes that occurred by a vote of the people, remember, prior to 1955, our Constitution simply said property owned by the government is exempt from property taxation. But the people voted, and I provided all of the press research that Mr. Gill had done, looking at that, and they added the language to our Constitution used primarily for a governmental purpose. But the legislature has never defined that. But each and every year, I believe that needs to be done so that it's being administered uniformly. The information that I provided.
Before you go on.
Mhm.
So in your mind, it would be the legislature's job to determine what governmental use is? And that's where that would fall on to decide if it was or not?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely, and that is why governmental purpose on page 2, line 5, that's the beginning of this bill. We, as a legislative body, defining what is a governmental purpose. And so the language that you see before you was the culmination of many hours of testimony, but I will tell you that it was intended as a starting spot, right? As Senator Case indicated, it was taking all of the current statutes we talk about for federal government. Our current statutes say governmental use for federal government is everything excluding this. And then for state lands and property, we have an exemption that says everything except these are exempt. Then for counties, all we say is for governmental purpose. There's no list that accompanies that. For municipalities, now we've got the other thing. The other way, that law in the books currently says governmental purpose includes this, and it has a list going the other direction. So quite honestly, it is hard to administer. And unfortunately, we don't believe that it's appropriate to have governmental entities litigating at a cost to the taxpayers. It's better to just provide this guidance in statute. And we do have some litigation that has occurred. We've had litigation for municipalities, property owned currently. And so that's important to note as well. If a municipality owns property today and it's not being used for a governmental purpose, we have had assessors that have assessed that property and have been collecting taxes on that for years. Okay. But then we've got other counties where legal counsel may have told that assessor that, you know, the presumption legally with a governmental entity is that that property is exempt, and I don't think it's appropriate for us to go ahead and put them on the tax roll, so that assessor doesn't. Well, that's not fair across the state. So it's important that we have this discussion. Now, I will say that as Senator Case indicated, this bill is not as clear right now with the language. When I read this bill, I interpret it on page 2, on line 19, that the way it would start is that if property is owned by the government, any level of government, but leased to a non-governmental entity, and it starts with a list, but if it's leased to a non-governmental entity, regardless of whether a fee is charged or not, if it is leased, that it becomes taxable. Now, the way that's administered currently is the lessee in most of these situations is responsible for those taxes, just as if they owned the property, which takes us back to the Uintah County case, where basically it was a commercial use. The state of Wyoming was leasing that land to a commercial entity for use as a parking lot, and the Supreme Court said that's not a governmental use and that's taxable. What brought us into the agricultural land discussion is that one of the examples that the state of Wyoming provided was we have millions of acres, 3.4 million acres that the state of Wyoming currently leases to private lessees for grazing. And right now they are not being charged tax. And the Supreme Court said there is no exemption on the books. And if you want an exemption, that is something that is not for the court to decide. It's something for the legislature to decide. That's what makes this taking an action now more important than ever. Because without action being taken, as of January 1, 2025, county assessors across the state are scrambling with support of the Department of Revenue to get all of those agricultural leases on the tax rolls for 2025. What this bill does not do is create an exemption for those lands for 2025. So if the language in this bill and how I'm interpreting this were to go into effect for 2025, 26, in my mind, it just codifies the fact that assessors should be valuing those agricultural leases. And in 2025, we would need to continue to do so. However, if this bill were to pass with amendments, we indicate on page 3, we've got a line, page 3, line 5, where it speaks to idle government property, including vacant land and vacant structures, unless the entity is required to hold the property by law. Let me tell you where that language, required to hold the property by law. It came from a Supreme Court case where the Laramie County assessor valued and taxed a school that was vacant and actually being marketed for sale. And then that was one case, and then I'll back up, there was another case, because that one we were okay on because it was marketed and they actually ended up selling it. But we had a vacant land piece that was owned by the school district that the assessor attempted to tax, and the courts basically said, no, there's a law that requires schools to purchase that property in anticipation of building a school at a future time. And so the assessor lost that case. So what I'm saying is I don't want to be in a situation where there's litigation that is a necessity to get an answer. Could we, however, in that paragraph, perhaps cover these leases if the lease amount specific in statute is to fund governmental functions? I think that that's a possibility and an amendment that could be brought in if that is the will. I do believe that there's also possibly the public or legislators that may believe that if it's leased to a private entity, it should be taxable. So I think these are the policy decisions that this bill very appropriately addresses so that we're applying these exemptions uniformly across the state. Now, what I will say is that there's been some effort to just say, can't the legislature simply say property owned by the government is exempt from taxation? My personal belief is that you cannot, because our Constitution says it has to be primarily used for a governmental purpose. I do not believe that the legislature could simply create an exemption that, in my mind, is contrary to what our Constitution says. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would stand for any questions.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Brenda or Senator Case, on page 2, starting on line 2, as used in this act unless otherwise specifically provided. Line 5, governmental purpose means that a majority of the property is used for health, safety, and welfare. Education. I would argue, and please correct me if I'm going down the wrong path, that those lands that are leased out for grazing, that money that they pay to the state, that's for education. And the property used for health, safety, and welfare. Well, welfare, that money is for the welfare of our children in the schools. So I don't know. That would, to me, say that all state leases that are for grazing, leased out for grazing, should be under the governmental purpose. Correct me if I'm going down the wrong path, Brenda or Senator Case, please. Thank you.
Director Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator French, so the use is the immediate use. So if the land is being used for grazing, that's what it's being used for. The cash, that money flow, is not what is being tracked there. And so, for example, if the town or the county leases out a parcel of land and it's being used for a commercial purpose, the fact that any money that is derived by leases could be argued going to be used to provide government services. But that's not the case, and we do have case law related to that. So the use is how it's being used. It's being grazed, so it's grazing land. It's being used for a truck stop, so it's a truck stop. It's being used as a residential subdivision that we have communities that have platted subdivisions, and their intent is to market those subdivisions and sell those subdivisions. They never intend to use them to park snowplows on or have it be the county shop. Their entire reason for holding those lands is to sell them or maybe lease them out for an income. All this is saying is for property tax purposes, that's fine. You can do those. I'm excluding the provision at the end of this bill about selling it, but it says you can do those things. It's just that you have to pay tax on them. Just like the private sector office building or the private sector landowner that's going to lease to another ag producer. That's the focus, is just should there be taxes paid to help pay for services that government provides? That's the question. And so just trying to put government, if that land or buildings are not being used for a governmental purpose, should taxes not be collected to pay for services just like private sector with the same uses?
Follow up?
Thank you,
Senator
Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I would argue that those 3.4 million acres that are being grazed are for a governmental purpose, for the education of our children. And maybe I'm going down the wrong road here, but thank you.
Mr.
Director
Chairman,
Hinson?
I would just say that any governmental entity would and should make that claim. We own property, we're going to lease it out. Our intent is to use the money from those leases to fund other governmental services. If that is the will of the legislature, then you need to put it in statute that you believe that that is a governmental purpose, because we have case law currently that says that is not the use, that is not the governmental purpose. The governmental purpose and the use has to be using that property for health, safety, welfare, education, transportation, infrastructure. If you're not using the property that you own as a government for those items, there need to be taxes collected on that currently.
Senator Case?
I agree with Ms. Henson on this, but I'm not gonna die on this hill, and I don't think, I think if we carve out an exception for something, that'll just be fought separately in the courts. That's okay. Then we've got a bill that's lowered our risk of litigation on a whole host of other things. So we might accomplish 95% of good here. But I might have a couple of questions for Ms. Henson. One is, could we invent a system whereby the state of Wyoming makes payments in lieu of taxes to local governments for those grazing leases? I mean, thinking out of the box here, and those payments in lieu of taxes would, the way we do it is we'd make it so that the assessors wouldn't tax those lands, but we would provide a payment in lieu of taxes. And it might be, it might not be, it might be a bargain, you know, it might not necessarily be 100% of the tax liability, but we could do that from Cheyenne to local governments. That's, and I think that's a possibility. And then I have another question for Ms. Henson, if she'd help me thinking here. We have fine gentlemen from state parks here. You know, we talk about recreation facilities if they're provided by a private entity. Those would not be a governmental, or if they could be provided by a governmental entity, but state parks are a little bit different animal. There's no private alternatives to state parks per se. It is recreation. Can you think of a way that we could craft out protection for the state parks? Like Lendo, Sinks Canyon, Boyson, so they're not caught up in some of this language.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Case, so specific to the PILT question, the first question.
Right.
Well, the federal government provides states with payment in lieu of taxes. Now, typically, that's also to compensate for those buildings that are being used for governmental purpose. Those properties may be used for a governmental purpose, but the federal government recognizes that there are services that have to be provided to those properties as well. So they have this PILT payment. So could that be a situation with the state of Wyoming could do something similar? You know, we are sitting in Laramie County. I've long said, as the Laramie County assessor, it might be more value to value all the exempt properties in Laramie County as opposed to between all of the exemptions for property tax that are on the books for governmental owned property. But the key is, I think we could, in that law, even define, the federal government does, every student, when they start school, there's a form that you fill out and you give them information. Do you live on federal property? Do you go to, you know, where do you go to school? Those types of things. Could we put that process in place? I think we absolutely could. Now, that being said, that would be a new process that we would need to put the processes in place in statute and have staff that would administer those. So it's a possibility, but I do think that to the second question, in
State parks.
state parks, absolutely. I think we can, under that piece that talks about health, safety, welfare, education, transportation, infrastructure, or administrative purposes of the governmental entity, we can add right there and then include in our definitions, let's see, because we've got, maybe it's already covered. Page 5. On page 5, line 10, we define infrastructure. And we say infrastructure includes, without limitation, property used for parks, public grounds, alleys, sidewalks, cemeteries, golf courses, auditoriums, and parking lots.
So, Mr. Chairman, I saw that too when we went through it, but this sort of sounds like parks in a city, not, if we said parks or parkland and historic sites, we might have to add those two. But yes, I think we could do that.
And Mr. Chairman, keeping in mind the, in Senator Case, you still have the presumption that governmental owned property is exempt from taxation. So for a county assessor to take the position that under that definition of infrastructure where it says without limitation, property used for parks somehow excludes state parks, I'm not sure
It's
that
kind of
that would
reach, yeah.
be, yeah, that would be a long reach.
So, Mr. Chairman, the whole deal of this bill though, see, it doesn't go in for another year. It doesn't go into effect. So we can start trying to figure out how to implement it and fine tune it. And I guarantee there'll be a proposal that fixes the grazing land question. And we can vote that up or down. But this actually solves the problem of the Supreme Court case because it does define what's going to be taxable or not. It gives us cover right now. Anybody could bring some, airplane hangars, whatever, that could all be brought forward, and who knows how they're going to rule on that. Would seem, based on that precedent that they just issued with the truck stop, any of that should be taxable, including grazing.
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that for 2025, given we're already almost February of 2025, and assessors are to tax and assess property as they exist on January 1st, 2025. On January 1, 2025, state grazing leases are taxable unless there's an exemption that is backdated and put in place. Would it be possible to add language in this bill specific to state-owned property for 2025 that we see in whether it's Senate File 81, Senate File 68, absolutely, I think you could incorporate that into this bill. And then in 2026, if there are any additional amendments that need to occur, you would have time to do that.
Thank you, Director Henson. I have a couple quick questions. The mention of a bowling alley seems quite random and specific. So I'm assuming there's a story there. Would you share that with me?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know enough of the details, but I can tell you that whether it's a bowling alley, a movie theater, we have had testimony during the numerous years that we have had this discussion. There's case law on daycare centers. There are in many cases where from the public's mind or the competing entity down the street, that there have been questions about unfair competition, where the government has gotten in competition with private sector. And in fact, there, if you review that presentation that I provided, you'll see that there was some legislation many years ago where you could go to a state website and actually report if you were this private person and you believe the government was getting into private sector business, you could report that on this website. And unfortunately, we don't see many people reporting that. We only see people reaching out to legislators or their locally elected officials and saying, hey, what about that? Are you telling me that they aren't paying property taxes, but I'm trying to compete with them and I'm having to pay property taxes? I think it's a important piece, specifically given the fact that the reason we have taxes is to fund services. And typically, those uses require the same services as the private sector entity.
Quick follow-up, as far as a bowling alley or a movie theater, I completely agree with you. In fact, it's kind of bizarre to me that the government would be worried that a community had a bowling alley. That's definitely a private sector issue. It's kind of different than the grazing lands, but I'm just amazed that we helped build a bowling alley. Thank you, Director Henson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the comments on, and I would agree, and I agree with the spirit of this bill. I don't know, as we're ready, there's a lot to talk about. We're starting to get into property tax stacked on top of each other. We got a couple of bills already out regarding this issue, but you know, government competition with the private sector. I mean, if we're going to look at that, we should look at the Wyoming Business Council when they redistribute tax dollars and give them to a competing entity that already has, if there's two breweries and one of them borrowed the money from the bank and the other one got their money from the taxpayers, that's unfair competition as well too. So just a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One last note, because I do lease some properties out. Could I just have them get a tax ID and you can take care of that for me too? And I'm not just trying to be funny with that. Why isn't it just captured in the cost of the lease? I mean, that's what we do in the private sector, and it makes it pretty simple. I'm having a difficult time getting to the next level. Why didn't we just put it in the cost of the lease? Thank
So
you,
Chairman McEwen, that pretty much sums up this policy discussion that the legislature needs to have. Because this just clarifies what is a governmental purpose for property tax purposes. Most governmental entities, if they lease out land to a private party, there's a clause within that lease that says if there are any taxes owed, that the lessee's responsible for those taxes. We've got those throughout the state. It's just that we really don't have clarification on other types of uses. And the one thing I would be remiss if I did not let you know that this is the language that was considered with the first interim study on governmental purpose. We had a second interim study, and this bill and the language contained was brought forth again. However, the second time it was brought forth, the section on page 7, section 3, that speaks about the public entity being required to dispose of that property within 10 years. In that second attempt, that was taken out. So that's a possibility, because what government does and what they provide to their citizens, I really do believe that that is a conversation between the citizens and that governmental entity. All we're speaking to in this bill is if it's not being used as defined under governmental purpose, should it be taxable? Just like the privately held property down the street.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I hear from my ag folks is, yeah, I get it if I'm assessed for property offense, a shed on that state land that I lease. But now I'm gonna be paying property taxes on land that I don't own. And they're saying that's really not fair. It's one thing if they own it, sure, but that's comments I get. I think I support this moving forward to the floor, because there's a lot of things that we need to further discuss. You know, this may make it further, or it may not. But at least we can have some more discussion on this, because there's a lot of things, you know, pages and pages of, well, you're exempt, well, you're not, you are, you're not. So anyway, just comments. I support moving it forward.
Director Henson.
Chairman McEwen, Senator French, just to give you a few examples. Many post offices within the state of Wyoming, those buildings are privately owned and leased to the United States Postal Service. They're all taxable because the use is an income producing property for that landowner, that building owner. They're all paying taxes. Okay, now, how that is structured within the United States is their lease with that private owner. That's a private matter between them, but they are taxable. There are numerous examples of that. Federal government, Laramie County, we had an entire building that was built by private sector, leased to the federal government and taxable, because the use to that owner was income producing. Even though the government was leasing it, the property owner. So that's just kind of the opposite of what we're talking about here, because this is property owned by the government and used for a governmental purpose. But there are many properties that are used by the government, but not owned by the government, that are on the tax rolls.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I think we're gonna have to agree to disagree on this one, on the ag thing, paying taxes on land they do not own, so, thank you.
I think we beat this horse to the point it's hamburger now, so we'll bring up other comments. Thank you, Director Henson. I'd like to get to the third bill.
Committee. Well, thank you. Todd Ernst, Laramie County Assessor, speaking as the association. Not many comments. The only comment we really are kind of supporting is language of what is a governmental purpose. I mean, I think that's been a question throughout the years, what is truly governmental purpose? And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
So if I understand what you just said, if we decided a governmental purpose was a purple road, you'd be happy with that?
If it's up to the legislation to determine that, and you pass that, and it comes down to us, then yes, we'd have to follow the law.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anybody else in the audience?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Keith Kennedy for the Wyoming Wheat Growers. And broadly speaking, you mentioned grazing leases, but those are other agricultural lands as well. And the first point that I would make to you, and my understanding is that those agricultural leases currently specifically require the leasee to pay property tax on the improvements on that property. So for example, if I have a lease on some dry land here in Laramie County and I have a grain bin there, I owe property taxes on that, but not on the land. And those agreements are already in place. And what is unclear in my mind is this is one of the points that we would make. Those leases are for 10 years. And so there is, let's say that property taxes would be paid by the owner, which is the state trust lands. So the state would owe those until such time as that was built into those agreements as they came up for renewal. The other point that I would make is the comparison between, in that specific case of dry land, between private sector and leasing from the government. I actually looked to see what was paid or is willing to be paid on some parcels here in Laramie County that will be coming up that will actually likely be renewed here at the State Board of Land Commissioners next Tuesday. And they pay approximately $12.50. Right adjacent to that, I looked up another property, no improvements, very similar land capabilities, and their property tax is $2.50 an acre. So my couple of questions there. Assuming that I'm going to make a rational decision when I lease this state ground, I will factor that in to my bid. So essentially we're changing the mix here between, we're taking 20% of the money that goes directly to state trust lands, and we're taking that 20% and it's being allocated as all of the rest of the county property taxes are. The other thing that's in that particular case unreasonable of comparison between public and private is that in the case of private, most of those are what Senator French and I would call crop share agreements, where the landlord is at risk. And so there's a great deal of difficulty of comparing that, and as well as the other terms. With the state lands, the state is not responsible for any of the inputs such as fertilizer, which is very common with crop share leases. So it's, in that case, it's particularly difficult to compare private to cash lease essentially with the state. And with that, I'd welcome your questions.
Questions? Well, thank you for your testimony. Do we have anybody else in the audience? We have some on Zoom.
We do have two people that registered to testify on this topic. If they raise their hand, if they want to talk.
Yes.
Glenn Januska and Dixie Huxtable. So if either one would like to testify, if they'd raise their hand, I can let them in. I'm not seeing
Do I
any
have a motion?
hands. Oh, I do see a hand. I'm admitting Glenn Januska.
Guess I'll entertain that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yep. If I could begin, Mr. Chairman. My name's Glenn Januska. I'm the director of the Casper and Natrona County International Airport, and I wanted to thank you and the committee members for allowing me to provide testimony today. I want to give a little bit of background for our airports so you'll understand what our concerns are with the bill as it's presented. And we may be the poster child for the impact for this bill if the bill goes forward as it's been presented. For those of you who may not know, our airport was constructed during World War II as an Army air base. It was later transferred over to the county. We have right now currently over 120 buildings that were built during World War II that are on the historic register that we have been maintaining since that time. And in order for us to be able to maintain those facilities and be good stewards of the property that was transferred to us, we lease out those facilities. We're talking about buildings that for the World War II that were designed to last 5 years. So leasing those properties and leasing those buildings provides us the revenue to be able to not only maintain those buildings, but also provides us revenue necessary to operate the airport. I have right now about 220 lease and operating agreements for our airport. A lot of those agreements would be things that you would think would be non-aeronautical in nature. For example, lay down yard for pipe storage. I have 5,150 acres of land. Half of that land is agriculture. But we lease out those buildings for storage buildings. We have a document storage and destruction business. And then we have the things that you would consider aeronautical, hangars leased out for private individuals. I have 5 of our original World War II hangars. One's leased out to FedEx as a sorting facility. I have 2 of them leased out to Atlantic Aviation, which is a fixed base operator. I have a building leased out to Corporate Air that is a feeder service for cargo operations. So just to give you an idea, I have about another 10 buildings that are non-business or non-commercial related. So when we look at what is considered a definition of a governmental purpose, I agree completely with Senator Case. It's necessary for the legislature to define what a governmental purpose is. And if governmental purpose included airports and airport property, I would be happy and I would stand down and you probably would never hear from me again. But the way it's listed right now, when you talk about governmental purpose and what it doesn't include, when it talks about a lease to a use or lease for a non-governmental entity, and then it goes on to list airplane hangars and property for commercial operations. The vast majority of my buildings, 130 buildings in my property, are leased to non-governmental entities, including in our terminal building. We lease out space to the airlines. We lease out space to the rental cars. We lease out space to the gift shop and for the bar. We lease out space for a lot of different entities that would be considered non-governmental purpose. So when it comes strictly to a tax standpoint, we would have a lot of entities that would be subject to tax that are not right now. And I know the question comes up with fairness with the private sector and whether or not taxes should be collected for the services of governmental bodies. Absolutely. But what we do for the airport is we own our infrastructure. We're responsible for maintaining our roadways. We plow our roadways, we reconstruct our roadways. We have the water system and the sanitary system on the airport that we're responsible for. So taxing those from a tax standpoint means that that revenue is not going to stay with the airport for us to be able to provide critical aviation services. This revenue is what basically keeps us off of the tax roll and makes us self-sufficient, which is one of our grant requirements, and allows us to be able to reinvest in our aviation system and our facilities that benefit the state and the county. If those taxes do not come back to the airport, we still have all the responsibilities for government service providers. We provide the services, the revenue's not going to go to us. So is it fair to have us in a non-competitive situation with the private sector? Here's what we do. If a private sector business pays $1,000 in taxes, if I don't charge $1,000 more in my rates and charges, it's uncompetitive and I'm leaving money on the table. We charge the additional revenue to make up for the taxes because we need that revenue to pay for the services. So from a tax standpoint, this would have a devastating impact on our airport, with the revenue going away to other entities that are not providing the services that we're providing. It would make us less, basically, we would probably not be self-sufficient. We would be back to the county, Natrona County, for taxpayer support because of this. So from a tax standpoint, it's devastating, but that may go away based upon the other portion of it, which is sale. So if we have to take our facilities that are considered non-governmental, which is everything I just talked about, including airline space and rental car space, that's not been used for what's considered governmental purpose, and I have to basically sell that property, do you want us to be able to sell the airline ticket counter space in our terminal building? First of all, we can't do it. We're governed by our federal grant assurances. I'm governed by the document that transferred the property from the federal government to the county for governmental purposes. So we can't, first of all, do this. But from a practical standpoint, it doesn't make sense. If we had to sell our airline ticket counter space, which is leased to a commercial operation, United Airlines would say, great, we're going to buy up we're going to purchase all the ticket counter spaces just so they would never have competition. Rental cars, whoever had the best deal, wanted to be able to purchase our rental car facilities, would do this, and we would not have any competition. That's the unintended consequences, I think, that happens when you start talking about a requirement to start selling our facilities. From a practical standpoint, we can't do it. From a governmental standpoint, with our contractual obligations, with grant assurances and transfers, we can't do this. So that's what our concerns are. I think you have a solution. I think this body has voted, and I think also the Appropriations Committee has, on Senate File 68, which basically creates the task force to address this issue. This is just the issues that we have. I'm sure every single entity that's touched by this has their own stories. And I'm not sure if you all understand all of what's going to happen if this goes through and it's passed. So I think there's a solution. I think Senate File 68 is a solution that you've already agreed to be able to support. We just ask that that process goes forward so we have a chance to be able to choose. So that we're not having to basically sell facilities I don't think anybody really wants us to sell, and have a tax burden, which is going to go to just redistribution, but it's not going to come back to the airport who provides the services that the taxpayers are supposed to receive when they pay their property taxes. So, Mr. Chairman, that's my testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has questions.
You don't have a bowling alley out there, do you?
I do not, but there was a bowling alley here when it was a Army Air Base.
Okay, any questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We don't have anyone else, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case scared off?
No, I just low on time. I'll get back to the issue of whether we should have a pipeline yard. Whether the government should own a pipeline yard or not, but we'll do that later.
Do we want to hold a vote on this back? And
We're gonna hear from Ms. Huxtable. She's online, right? She didn't raise her hand. Oh.
She didn't raise her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I hope we do have a vote. I'd like to pass it forward. Do you want a motion?
what's your plan? Well, let's close public comment. What's
Okay.
your pleasure?
Move the bill.
Moved by Senator Case, second by Senator Pappas. Let's work the bill. Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this point, I've got to be a no vote. That was pretty good testimony from the airport guy. We do have a bill here already in 68 that sort of sets the stage here. We get a task force. I always hate to hear we need to have an interim topic, but this is a heavy lift here. And so with that, I won't talk anymore and just explain my vote. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Case.
this was a task force. This was an entire interim of the Joint Revenue Committee. They came up with a bill that really helps us as we move forward in these lawsuits in what is a governmental purpose. If you don't like the part about selling the land, you just delete section 3. And if you don't want to put in an amendment with respect to agricultural leases, you could do that as well. But why do we sit here and think that an airport in Natrona County can have industrial land that they lease for industrial purposes to for-profit entities with some big name companies that were named and others that compete directly with other for-profit entities and somehow think that's a good idea? That one escapes me, Mr. Chairman.
Director Hanson, I have a question. Is that airport a public-private entity? Do they collect any tax dollars or do they have any of the mill levies? Are they a special district?
Mr. Chairman, so I don't know the specifics of the Natrona County Airport. I can tell you that they are not the only airport in this state that owns property that is not used for aviation. There is language in the bill that you're considering that talks about transportation and aviation facilities being exempt. As far as the lack of uniformity statewide, you're sitting in a county where the airport board owns an office building, built it for income producing purposes, and it's been taxed and on the tax rolls ever since it was built. That's the type of concern that is out there. Assessors do not have clear guidance on what is the legislative intent. If you intend for airport aviation facilities to be, everything related to aviation to be exempt, then I believe that there's language in the bill that you've got currently, and it could be beefed up. But if the intent is that if the property is being used for something other than aviation, should it be taxable? And if it should be taxable, it should be taxable statewide. But specific to your question, I don't know exactly what the structure is in Natrona County. I apologize.
But Mr.
Okay,
Chairman,
thank you.
it's apparent that some of those facilities, like a pipe yard, why wouldn't that be taxed? When down the street, there's another pipe yard belonging to another company that's fully taxed. And they do the exact same thing. The great thing about this bill is it doesn't even go into effect till July of next year, not July 25, July 26. It'd give us lots of time to kind of work on this. But as a business owner, and I know all of us are, I can't see why we would tolerate the government competing against us directly or indirectly.
Any other comments? My question is, have we found ourselves in another situation where there's a mill levy that supports the airport, and then we turn around and tax the airport?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we wouldn't be taxing the airport functions that are a governmental entity, but the ancillary uses of their leased properties and things like that. So it's not the airport function. I was kind of ridiculous actually about the ticket counter the gentleman was talking about in my mind, but it's not those airport functions. It's the things that aren't even related to providing an airport function, like using, having an old building that's an industrial facility. Or there was a large transportation carrier mentioned that delivers packages. You know, they don't, at the Riverton Airport, their facility's off the airport. It's close, but it's off the airport. They pay taxes, I assume. Here, they don't pay taxes, they're on the airport. But what's the difference? The airport's huge because in World War II, it's a big airport. It's a lot of land. In fact, there was another one over there at, in Bar None, but now it's being used for private purposes. We got a year and a half to work this bill out and to hear the complaints and fix it.
Just real quick.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, like I said, I agree with the spirit of this. I'm just not comfortable. I don't want to have a sagebrush rebellion between now and when we get it on the Senate floor if we don't do any, before we get to amendments on this. And I think a good, clean bill coming, out of the interim would be a better approach. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Donna, you want to, well, let's go through the bill real quick. Getting ahead of myself. Any changes on page 1? Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. Page 5.
Mr. Chairman? Line 11, I would do, after the word parks, after the comma, insert parklands and historic sites. It's not the best language in the world, but it would be getting at our state park system. That's what I'm trying to get at there. I think when they say parks, I'm thinking like, that's a city park. And like Glendo, I don't think of Glendo as being a park. I think of it. So I'm using the word parkland to be more encompassing. That would be my motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we put an amendment for parklands and historic sites on line 11 of page 5. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? That amendment has passed. Moving on to page 6. Page 7.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, page 7, line 10, I changed 10 to 20. Mr. Chairman, that would give the government entities more time to deal with this vacant land issue. I think 10 was lots of time, but I detect pushback on that issue, so I did 20. No doubt they'll change the statute before that runs out.
It's been moved that we change line 10 from 10 years to 20 years. Any comments? All in favor of that amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Page 8. The effective date is January 1st, 2026. Do we want to change that?
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to change it to 2027.
We have a second? It's been moved by Senator Case, seconded by Senator Pappas, that we change 2026 to 2027.
And Mr. Chairman, that would give plenty of time for 2 interim committees to work this concept. Not just one.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, that amendment has passed also. Donna, we call the roll?
This is a roll call vote on Senate File 185 as amended, governmental property taxation and sale. Senator Case?
Aye.
Senator French?
No.
Senator Ide?
No.
Senator Pappas?
Aye.
Chairman McEwen?
No.
We have 2 aye and 3 no, Mr. Chairman.
That bill has failed to make it out of the Revenue Committee. Having said that, I still want to pursue it.
I do too. Can we do an interim topic?
Do whatever you want, you're the revenue committee.
We probably should have got it up there, but this is like voting for something you don't know what's in it yet.
I might change my vote. Donna. Donna. I want to change my no to an aye.
So, Mr. Chairman, we now have on Senate File 185 as amended, we now have 3 aye and 2 no.
Thank you. Guess we'll do 163.